So find the seat where you can. I have opened up the tabletops for you, so it's not quite the same as yesterday's trenches. I know there might be one or two seats, not quite enough, so make it work. Make it work.
Hey, can you hand me my laptop? It's right on here. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Roll right behind Kyle.
Yes. Yes. Give my backpack. You're murdering my backpack.
We'll get your backpack. I'm trying. It's stuck.
Girl,
You can't just pull it.
yeah, it's hard for you to say from speculation and on the top. Here we go. And now I can go.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please remain standing for a moment of silence. Everyone have a great day.
All quiet on the Western Front. So we're not in the trenches quite the same as yesterday, but we are still in the trench line. I think everybody has a fair amount of space. Try to make it work. We got 2 rows going on. Here's a question I want you to ask yourself. Ask yourself, answer to yourself, but then in a second you can turn to your shoulder partner and share with him as well. Question on the screen behind with me. Who do you need a truce with today? Who are you fighting and maybe you just don't need to keep that fight going anymore? Who do you need a truce with today? Big question, heavy question. Think to yourself for a second. And as you have that answer, if you feel comfortable, turn to your shoulder partner and share with them. Who do you need a truce with today?
I don't think I have any. I need a
Hear about rivals? Maybe some close relationships? Maybe your frenemies? Frenemy, that's a new word for this year. All right, so by the virtue of how you sat, I did not divide you into teams today, but by the virtue of how you sat, I want to consider this front row to be one army, one set of trenches. And since y'all sat in the back row, you are a different set of trenches. Obviously, there's the desks between you. So front row, turn around a little bit. Just turn in your seat, turn and face them. Take your paper and show it to them. Take the paper and show it to them. Take the paper and show it to each other. Front row, tell them how ugly they are. Tell them how ugly they are. Talk some smack.
You're women.
Back row, tell them how weak they are. Tell them how weak sauce their family is. Tell them how weak sauce their family is. Can I get a yo mama joke? Tell them how bad they are at sports. Tell them how bad their country is.
No,
Keep it up. Keep that smack talk up. Y'all not so good at the insult game. Keep going. I need to hear an ugly joke. I need to hear a fat joke. I need to hear a you're bad at sports joke.
College, stop being racist.
Yeah, college. Stop being racist.
Hey, at least I'm
I can hear nothing.
Y'all had a job and
That's offensive to me. That's the point. Now you gotta be like, at least I'm not white.
at least I'm not black.
Yeah.
Shots fired.
We're all the same team.
Perfect power will not be tolerated
This time.
Recognize the tune?
What are you trying to do?
Recognize the tune?
Hey, friendly fire will not be tolerated.
Do you recognize the tune?
No. Oh, it's Silent Night. Fortunate time.
You might not recognize the words because they are in Austrian. But I bet you recognize the tune. What song is this? Silent Night. Silent Night, Heilige Night. Silent Night, Holy Night in the original Austrian language. If you were on the Western trenches on Christmas Eve of 1914, this might be something you heard breaking the cold silence between no man's land. Because what happened on Christmas Eve of 1914 is one of the most amazing, almost too good to be true, hard to actually believe events in, I think, all of world history, certainly in the history of World War I. What happened on Christmas Eve of 1914? What happened on Christmas Eve of 1914 is that the two armies arrived at an informal armistice, a laying down of the arms or a truce. I asked you who you might need to have a truce with, and you came up with a bunch of different answers. I heard Appling County, Brantling County, my cousin, my frenemy. Right? You might need a truce with someone in your life. What happened on Christmas Eve of 1914 is that the two sides, us versus them, sides that have been shooting at each other days before, for months before, probably days before, just hours before, had been shooting at each other, arrived at an informal truce in recognition of a holiday that tends to unite us all. And this is known as the Christmas Truce of 1914. I'm going to show you a video while I have you at this place, quiet, respectful, paying attention. I'm going to show you a video of what it might have felt like, what it might have looked like to be in the trenches on that night. I want you to let yourself go there, right? Look. Can you be there? Hear. Can you be there? You know, I can't quite get some smells to come through the screen, but I feel like I can almost smell the scene in front of me. So watch this video and think about what it might have been like to be in the trenches on Christmas Eve of 1914. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the truce of Christmas Truce of 1914 as well.
Skip! No! No, don't do it!
Es liegt bewaffnet! Es liegt bewaffnet! Nein, Otto! Nein!
Meine Damen und Herren, mein Name ist Otto. Pleased to meet you, Otto. Freut mich. How are you? Gut, gut. Und du? Noch sauber. Rose, ist schön. Schön. Danke. Happy Christmas. Frohe Weihnachten.
This is what's on the screen.
That was an ad?
That was
Oh,
not.
God.
So what you saw, yeah, in the end it was an ad for chocolate, but don't get distracted by that. What you saw was one of the realest renderings of what I think it might have been like to be in the trenches on that night. I'm gonna give you the super brief version orally, right, from me, and then we're gonna watch one more video that kind of grabs a whole lot of the details and I think will illuminate it to you as well. I did hear from a couple of you that you maybe talked about this in ELA before. What grade was it? Seventh grade. Ray and Homer were telling me you might have read a story in English class related to the Christmas Truce of 1914. So this is not one of the mega points to be made in world history. This is not something that would traditionally show up on a test. I don't teach to a test. I teach a life. And I want to tell you about the Christmas Truce of 1914 because it's really changed my life. It's made me realize you can lay your arms down and quit fighting the war, and the war can be over. And I might give that idea to you as well. What was on your papers here? I'm supposed to hate you. It is double-sided. I'm supposed to hate you too, right? I didn't even tell you which side to hold up. That was the mutual attitude between these armies. Two nations that were generally Judeo-Christian in background, right? It's one thing for armies of different religions to fight each other. Maybe we can even understand their differences if we come from like big different ideas. These two countries were generally Judeo-Christian in background, So what you really have is two Christian nations fighting each other, but they think that they're supposed to hate each other. They're told that the other team is the bad guy. So what they brought to the trenches was this belief. What happened in the Christmas Truce of 1914 is on Christmas Eve, across portions of the trench line. Now, I don't want you to think this happened across all 500 miles. There are stories of the fighting continuing, the bombing, the shooting, the shelling. But across many different segments of the trench lines, soldiers arrived at informal truces, right? An agreement to live and let live, and let's just celebrate this holiday together. On Christmas Eve, as you saw in the movie, across different portions of the trench line, soldiers called out to each other across the trench lines. If the trench lines were close enough for shouting distance, there is a confirmed story of this silent night being sung in Austrian. The Germans, right, the belligerents, the Germans started to hang lights above the trench line, lighting candles, even raising a whole tree. The British, from the other side in this particular story, they didn't quite know if they were about to experience an attack, maybe like George Washington's attack on Christmas Eve, or the Germans really going to attack on the eve of this holiday. So the British, they kind of braced. What's coming next? Are they about to come over the top? Will we be sucking down gas here in just a few minutes? Instead, what they heard was, in its original Austrian language, Silent Night, Holy Night, Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, Silent Night, Holy Night. And not to be outdone, the British returned with Christmas carols of their own. Eventually, in this particular anecdote, the two sides harmonized Auld Lang Syne together. So you have these two belligerents, these two armies that have been shooting at each other, singing together and harmonizing in peace. For a lot of these soldiers, they genuinely expected the war to be over within a month or so, right? The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was in July of 1914. These soldiers thought, we're going to go and have one big tell-all battle, and surely we'll be home by Christmas. Well, they found themselves in the trenches on Christmas, thinking about home, thinking about loved ones, maybe wondering why we're here in the first place. So they took the occasion to have this moment of peace. Christmas Eve was not the big truce. Some soldiers maybe crawled out into no man's land. There are individual stories of soldiers trading chocolates and cigarettes, not unlike you saw in the movie, right? They traded their goodies with each other, even secretly. So Christmas Eve was kind of that low-level truce, right? Individual soldiers meeting in the middle, ha ha ha. You know what they were surprised to find? They were surprised to find that each of them were human. Each of them thought they kind of had the same idea. I'm fighting for freedom. You're not fighting for freedom. I'm fighting for freedom. Isn't that crazy? They both thought they were fighting for freedom. Well, come the morning, December 25th, 1914, cool, crisp. A lot of soldiers write in their journals that there was a break in precipitation. There was a break in the rain. Instead, there was a freeze, which actually made the flooring of the trenches hard and easy to walk on, instead of soft and mucky and muddy. So it's kind of a welcome break from the previous weather conditions. And on this morning, on Christmas Eve morning, or Christmas morning, 1914, across various portions of the trench line, in total, we know that about 100,000 soldiers participated in one of these local truces, one of these local armistices. So again, not the whole 500 miles of trench line, but many, many portions experienced this local trucing. And what happened generally was that one head would poke up, not quite sure if it would get shot at or not. When it didn't get shot at, the body followed, and very hesitantly, much like you saw in the video, very accurate description, soldiers meeting in the middle. Like, are we going to do this? Are we really going to do this? Let's have ourselves a Christmas day. Soldiers met in the middle. Sometimes it was the officers that negotiated the truce for the day. And what followed is something truly unbelievable. We start to see soldiers doing incredibly human things. One of the most iconic moments and photos that comes from this is British and German soldiers playing soccer, football, I don't know what I'm supposed to call it, playing soccer together. British and German soldiers playing soccer together. Man, if only we could have solved our differences with the soccer game instead of shooting at each other. Another small anecdote, I think this is on the smallest of stories, but I think it's the most human thing possible. A German soldier set up a haircutting station, and he offered haircuts to anyone who got in line. Didn't matter what country you came from, didn't matter the color of your skin, didn't matter which side you were fighting for. What a human thing, right? Everybody needs a haircut. He offered haircuts to anyone who got in line. Mostly, this trucing lasted just for the one day. Some soldiers used it for not trucing purposes. Some soldiers were scouting the enemy lines. Some soldiers were rebuilding their own lines. So there was definitely still war and war activities going on during this truce. But by and large, most of the soldiers really discovered that the other side was just as human as they were. I'll tell you one more little tiny story, and then I'll show the video that kind of peels it all back. One more little tiny story. Another activity they did during this time frame, soccer, haircutting, trading gifts, taking photos, is that it was kind of a moment to get the dead out of no man's land and bury them in a peaceful moment instead of wondering if you're going to get shot at. And in doing this, they also had joint memorial services, joint burial services. So the English who killed the Germans may have attended a German burial. The Germans who killed the English and the French may have attended an English or French burial ceremony. It's a recognition of how we're all in this human disaster together, and they attended each other's memorial services. Well, in one of these memorial services, a British man, and this man goes on to be a pretty prolific writer after the war, he observed the Germans making rudimentary, wooden crosses to go onto their graves, as grave markers. They broke down some boxes that had supplies in them. They made wooden crosses to go as grave markers. Well, on these wooden crosses, it says, "For the fatherland and for freedom." And he says to the Germans, "What do you mean for freedom? We are fighting for freedom. You started the war, we're fighting for freedom." And the German says, "Oh, Englishman, my comrade, we are fighting for freedom." They both thought that they were fighting for freedom. Additionally, on this wooden cross, it says, "Buried here, known only to God." And the Englishman says, "God is on our side." And the German says, "No, God is on our side." They genuinely believed they were both fighting for freedom. They genuinely believed that they were both right. So something I always wonder is, why didn't this truce last? Why wasn't this the final armistice? Why wasn't this the laying down of the arms that ended the war? Unfortunately, generals and officers, it's always officers messing things up, right? I'm an officer in the Army, and I'll tell you, it's always officers that are messing things up. The officers and the powers that be, the leaders of these countries, they didn't like this Christmas truce. They didn't like this laying down of arms. And long story short is that hostilities began, picked back up the following day. Some portions of the line kind of held out all the way till New Year's, a week-long truce, week-long armistice. For most portions of the line, literally, they concluded their truce, just like we shook hands in the beginning. Well, now we met in the middle, and officers fired their pistols into the air and walked away as if to say hostilities are back on. So the truce really was just this magical 24-hour moment in most portions of the trenches where the war was over. And I just really wonder why they wouldn't have let the war stay over. I'm going to show you this one more video. It is animated. I'll explain one more picture here. This is a variety of pictures. You can see they got reported in the news. Christmas truce at the front. These are Germans and Frenchmen taking pictures together. Same thing here. And this moment is commemorated by a variety of statues. That's one of my favorites that I have a picture of, where it shows these soldiers shaking hands over the trench lines. There's a soccer ball there to commemorate the fact that soccer was one of the big activities they engaged in during this truce. Now I'll show you this video. This is on the animated side of things, so it is not as realistic as the video you just saw, but it is very informative. And for those of you that have any interest in the stories I'm telling you, I think you'll like the extra that comes here. I'm going to leave the words on the bottom of the screen, because just to make sure everybody can hear and see what's being said. So pay attention. I'm going to ask you what your favorite fact is at the end. So try to log in your brain what your favorite fact is, and we'll talk about it at the end here.
1914. The war was supposed to be over by now.
Audio good?
This little holiday special is brought to you by World of Tanks. Use the invite code ARMISTICE if you're a new player who
Everybody's got
wants
a
to check out the
monetize,
game.
all right?
The The Christmas Truce is one of the most poignant events of the First World War, a time when men rose up above the madness of the conflict and, for just a moment, saw each other as fellow humans. This is an event that definitely did happen. Thousands of men laid down arms in the truce, but a century of retellings has also kind of sanded down its rough edges and oversimplified its messy reality. Indeed, this event wasn't just the result of pure human spirit and holiday cheer. It was a host of unique factors that drove these enemies to spontaneously declare peace in no man's land. And really, it may not have been all that spontaneous. Small armistices were happening every day. As frontline troops became accustomed to the rhythms of trench warfare, they learned that looking the other way now and then could bring a shred of safety and calm to their lives. The armies ate meals at the same time, which became a daily ceasefire. Patrols frequently ignored each other, adopting a live and let live attitude. Troops often shouted to each other across the lines. After all, the autumn battles had passed, and both sides were waiting out the winter. In reality, the weather was the primary enemy for both sides. The high water table at Flanders meant that the trenches were always filling with water, sometimes collapsing and burying men inside. Soldiers leaned against the walls to sleep, trying to keep themselves out of the wet. Food supplies had to be hung up on dugout ceilings. And that winter had been particularly miserable. Weeks of rain flooded the dugouts. The mud pulled men down like quicksand. Now, British Field Marshal Sir John French had noticed the hands-off attitude his men were developing towards the enemy, and so he ordered attacks in late December to boost morale, and this resulted in heavy British losses. Concerned about possible fraternization over the holiday, he issued orders that no unofficial armistice would be tolerated. Morale was much better over in the German trenches. After all, they were winning, but many men were also experiencing their first holiday away from home. Knowing that this would be difficult, commanders brought Christmas to the trenches, shipping thousands of presents to the field. Each man received a gift from the Kaiser: cigar boxes for NCOs, a pipe with the Crown Prince on it for the ranks. The British, for their part, received a brass box from Princess Mary filled with cigarettes, tobacco, a Christmas card, and sweets.
So I've got my essay written, and I've been working on it for about a week. So now I'm going to show you how I use Grammarly to edit. Okay, so here's my essay, and I'm going to click through Grammarly suggestions in the right.
And then there were personal packages. Enterprises sprang up on the home front, offering family members a chance to send gift boxes to the troops. British soldiers received plum puddings and 1,000-count boxes of cigarettes. German and Austrian troops were bombarded with chocolate and salami and cognac. Both sides received winter clothing. In truth, though, the gifts were kind of a nuisance. I mean, there was nowhere to put it all. Soldiers didn't have a place to store 1,000 extra cigarettes. But that Christmas Eve delivered a true gift. The rain stopped, and the trenches drained. Dry cold froze the mud into a hard surface, almost like a floor. Snow dusted the countryside. That afternoon, the gunfire dwindled, and in some sectors it stopped entirely. The weather just seemed too nice for it. The Germans, stuffed with Christmas chocolate and cheered by the weather, started putting lit Tannenbaum up on their trench parapets. And then the German line started singing. Over on the British parapets, watchmen of the Scots Guard saw lines of lights along the enemy trench. At first, they suspected an attack, but then they heard an ethereal sound drifting across no man's land. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, the original Austrian version of Silent Night. Sensing a challenge, Guards Officer Lieutenant Sir Edward Hulse decided that they should drown this out with their own carol. The sides went back and forth, but soon the competition merged into a harmony of Good King Wenceslas and Old Lang Syne. The men began shouting Christmas greetings across the line, jokingly at first. A few even stepped out to talk. Hulse didn't know it, but the same thing was happening up and down the entire British line. Agreements formed. In some sectors, the officers met at the wire and shook hands, agreeing to cease hostilities the next day. In other areas, the ranks took the lead, Germans shouting across no man's land, "English, tomorrow if you no shoot, we no shoot." At times, it was just one brave soul walking into no man's land, waving a newspaper. These overtures were extremely dangerous. Though peace was breaking out in certain areas, it didn't happen everywhere. One British regiment responded to German caroling with a machine gun blast. Some unarmed soldiers were gunned down trying to broker this holiday armistice. But in most sectors, the ceasefire held. This truce mostly happened between German and British units. The French and the Belgians, whose countries were under German occupation, were less inclined. There were agreements to bury the dead and cease hostilities, but not as much fraternization. Yet a Bavarian unit held fire during a French mass, and both sides halted fighting long enough for a guest, a soloist from the Paris Opera, to make a performance. British Indian troops, who were a bit unfamiliar with this whole Christmas deal, saw the lit German trees and thought of their own holiday of Diwali. They held fire, but also held position, until some Germans tempted them out of the trenches with cigars and cigarettes. Soon the men were smoking together on the parapet. That Christmas night, the troops slept in sublime quiet.
Want to get your Ninja on without ads? Get YouTube Premium. All YouTube, no interruptions.
Your personal guide to the world of K-pop. Sign up for YouTube Music Premium with 1 free month.
Christmas Day dawned, bright and cold. The sky clear for the first time in weeks. To their shock, British troops looked across no man's land to see the Germans walking around on their parapets. Such a thing was suicidal in daylight, and that gesture of trust, more than anything, lured a few British out. It was heaven to at last stand up straight and walk on solid earth. Some had ventured into no man's land on Christmas Eve, but in daylight it was impossible to ignore the bodies lying between the trenches. The two sides buried their dead in common graves, grieving side by side in joint services, listening to the faraway sounds of battle from other sectors. And that shared experience broke down the wall. Soldiers milled about together in no man's land, swapping overabundant gifts from home. British beef for uniform buttons, chocolate cake for barrels of beer. They exchanged hats. One German barber gave haircuts. The men chatted. After all, they shared so much in common. They lived in the same fields under the same rain, and they were equally sick of war. Besides, they were curious. What was life like on the other side? Who were these enemies? One British officer was perplexed to learn that his new German friend believed the armies of the Kaiser fought for freedom. That was impossible, the officer responded. We're fighting for freedom. Amid this, Lieutenant Hulse found himself talking to Lieutenant Thomas of the 15th Westphalians, who had something to pass on, a Victoria Cross and a packet of letters. An English officer had died in the German trench during the last attack. Perhaps he could give these to the man's family? Touched, Hulse removed his own silk scarf, a gift from home, and presented it in thanks. Thomas, embarrassed that he had nothing to give in return, sent a soldier to fetch the fur gloves that his family had sent. Up and down the line, men started bringing out footballs. Kickabouts broke out, with men from both sides chasing the ball among shell holes and sliding on the frozen ground. In one sector, a group of Highlanders challenged a Saxon regiment, who burst out laughing whenever a kilt flew up during play. But not all of this activity was goodwill. On both sides, a few used the gatherings to reconnoiter enemy trenches, and both sides used the time to repair dugouts. Of course, for some, this fraternization appeared false. One British soldier flashed his squad mate a hidden dagger, while another refused to smoke German cigarettes, fearing that they might be poisoned. When one squad of Bavarians discussed whether to meet the British, their corporal snapped at them. Such a thing should not happen in wartime. Have you no German sense of honor left at all? They weren't surprised. The night before, the same soldier had refused to join the unit's Christmas service. Corporal Hitler was odd like that, but his disapproval reflected the general's view. This was exactly the situation that Field Marshal French had feared. Commanders dispatched senior officers to threaten disciplinary action and insist that the men restart the war. In some sectors, the armistice came to an orderly close. Officers from both sides saluted and fired revolvers into the air, signaling that, all right, the war was back on. In a few places, troops resisted until nearly to New Year's Eve, but the generals would not have it. German command dispatched snipers to break the ceasefire. French ordered an artillery barrage, letting the machinery of war roll over the human connections of the frontline troops. Nothing like this Christmas truce would happen again. The generals wouldn't allow it. On Christmas Eve 1915, British officers ordered a 24-hour artillery barrage. Men who tried to form a truce were court-martialed. Machine guns drowned out German carols. But the generals needn't have bothered. The spirit of that truce was unique to 1914, a symptom of a young war. By Christmas 1915, those troops had experienced chlorine gas and creeping bombardments. Zeppelins were bombing London. The Battle of Verdun would end just before the holiday, leaving 750,000 casualties. Indeed, many of the men who celebrated in no man's land that day would never see another Christmas. One of those unlucky ones was Lieutenant Sir Edward Holtz, who had sung carols and given a German officer his silk scarf. He died 3 months later while trying to save a wounded comrade. He was 25. And yet, Holtz is not remembered today for his military achievements, or even the book of letters that his friends published after his death. He and so many others are remembered for a victory entirely their own, when a group of brave men ventured into the line of fire, trusting their enemies not to shoot, and believing that humanity was better than the bonfire it had built for itself. Happy holidays, everybody.
What's your favorite fact? What'd you pull out of that?
World tanks. Christmas trees. I was about to say.
Corporal Hitler was cranky like that. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So we will talk more about Hitler after Thanksgiving. Obviously, we'll talk about him in light of World War II. But he does get his start as a young soldier, pretty low ranking, a corporal in World War I. And he disapproved of the truce that goes against the German sense of honor. How dare you partake in activities like that? But Corporal Hitler was cranky like that. I love that statement. What else? Something you grabbed out of that?
Generals were generally
Generals were generally in disapproval. Yeah. So, like I already made the joke, officers always messing things up. I am an officer in the Army, and sometimes you gotta follow that chain of command. I was just following orders. But the lower ranks, the ones really on the front lines, they saw the humanity in the situation. Those more removed from the front lines said the war has to go on. Good thought, Jackson. Eric, what you got? Yeah, so again, for that first Christmas especially, people really thought it was going to be, the conflict was going to be over pretty quickly. Plot twist, it wasn't. So how do you keep the boys happy? Send a bunch of gifts. Even branded gifts, like I'm going to print my face on a pipe and you're supposed to like it because I'm a princess, or cigarettes and chocolate. Those seem to be very common gifts as well. Anything else? I don't want to miss anybody. Any favorite fact?
They put the Christmas trees on the.
They put Christmas trees on the top of the trench line. That's true. I should pull my Christmas tree in here. I missed that. Where do they get a soccer ball? Delaney, that's a great question. Soldiers will bring with them comfort items. Soldiers always will bring comfort items. There are several primary source anecdotes, journals, letters home of soldiers, sneaking a ball into their kit and even having a way to pump it up. I don't exactly know what kind of pump they would have used, but soldiers will always find a way to have some recreation, even on the front lines. There's even stories of soldiers going over the top kind of into a game where when the whistle happened, over the top, some knuckleheads would throw the ball out there too, and they'd race. They'd kick the soccer ball as they charged at the enemy. Interesting stories of the humanity of war. So a couple of real pictures. Like I said, I always like to show you primary sources, real photos of the Christmas truce happening. You can tell the differences in uniforms. Those are enemies playing soccer with each other. These are enemies sharing cigarettes with each other. And this is still commemorated with a variety of statues today. First question I asked you was, who do you need a truce with today? I don't know your answer. It might be as simple as a sports rivalry. It might be larger and you didn't even really say it. I need a truce with my grandparents. I need a truce with my parents or my fill in the blank who stepped out of my life for whatever reason. I don't know who you need a truce with today, but maybe this story can show you that the war is over if you want it to be. I will always wonder why the war wasn't over at Christmas of 1914, because the war could have been over if they just would have let it be. This could be how the story ends. Unfortunately, it's not. And after we go to the bathroom, we'll come back and talk about how it actually ends. We'll talk about the rest of the war. This is a lengthier documentary about the Christmas truce. certainly don't have time to watch a 50-minute video, I will post this on Google Classroom. We're in that season of the holidays. We're headed towards Thanksgiving and Christmas. Pretty timely story for us to think about. What does it mean to be peaceful? What is peace on earth? What is a truce? Remember, the war is over if you want it to be. Huh? I don't think I do.
Probably. Hey, get out of my way. Get out of my way. You making me?
Why does that have human eyes? The bear.
Keyboard, I bet you were.
Wait, what were you?
I
I said you was David.
They at the wall.
You couldn't even do that. I need another pair of notes. My social batteries.
All right, pull out your World War I notes. Ray has them as an example. We have not finished them, and we are about to.
That's what she said.
So it's these notes. We have not gotten to a couple of the sections.
I have a question. He said,
In the reserve trenches, they may have had a way to bathe. Showers
well, that's not what I mean.
in the reserve trenches would have been their time. Because remember, staying dry and having good hygiene is part of being healthy.
Oh, yeah.
And if you're unhealthy and you get sick, you can't be a soldier. You can't be a fighter. So pull out these notes. Pull out these notes. I gave you all the feel good. I gave you the sentimentality. I gave you a fun little extra story. Now we got to dive through. Now we got to dive back into the actual learning. Unfortunately, the Christmas Truce of 1914 is not how the story ends. So I'm going to tell you how the story actually ends.
Hey, I have a question. We have advice on this was new.
You got advice? I think there's one section that's slightly out of order. I tried to rearrange the notes in a particular order. I have not told you about the Russian Revolution yet. The rest of it should flow after that, though. Are we there? Are we there? Are we there? Everybody has some tabletop space? I'm going to take the trenches down after today, so I hope you enjoyed the immersion.
And you do like for water gun for tomorrow, so.
You want to bring a Nerf gun and a water gun fight?
Oh, yeah.
All right, let me get through today. I got to get through this next chunk. I will then talk about tomorrow's water gun battle royale, and I will answer all the questions you have. So let's remember how we got here. We talked about the main reasons for World War I. What is M? Militarism. What is A? Alliances. I. Imperialism. N. Nationalism. So those are the four long-term causes. One straw that broke the camel back. We call it the immediate cause. What happened?
Ferdinand died.
Yeah, Breckin shot. Who was the Archduke? Breckin shot Fabian. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and then the dominoes fell. Okay, Serbia and Austria-Hungary, they're the little brothers kind of scrapping at each other. Cat fight. But then Germany, Russia, and Great Britain, they're the big brothers that come in with the sucker punches. And this is how we start to have World War I. The dominoes, boom, 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 boom. The dominoes fell, everybody's involved in the war. How does America get involved in the war? Yeah, so two events, one of them being the event. The sinking of the Lusitania starts the conversation. Ooh, bad Germany, why are they targeting civilian ships? But that doesn't quite lead America to the point of wanting to go to war. Hey, that junk's over there. Why don't we just stay over here? There's a whole ocean between us. Paraphrasing a little bit. That's more or less the attitude. However, the Zimmerman telegram tried to turn what country against us? Mexico. Germany tries to inspire Mexico to attack from the south. It never happens. We don't go to war with Mexico in the 19 teens. but because Germany was trying to play in North America, now we got to get involved. So the Zimmerman telegram is the reason the United States gets involved in the war. Julia.
So why doesn't Mexico, Canada, Brazil, and all these other countries get in fights and wars?
So bigger question there. Some countries have a policy of neutrality or isolationism, and they live in their own space and they call it good. America tried to do that for a long time, but the more you put yourself out there, the more you're probably going to get involved in international affairs. George Washington warned against that. Diving into U.S. history a little bit, George Washington said, hey, be careful of foreign entanglements. My advice to you before I leave office is to not get involved in foreign entanglements. And we as a country, we tried to follow that for a long time. World War I is seen as the real breaking of George Washington's precedent. Launch into World War II, launch into the Cold War and the era we're in today. We no longer mind our own business in North America. We are definitely involved all around the world. So that was a big answer to a big question. Did I answer you a little bit? All right, moving on. We find ourselves now in a two-front war. What were those two fronts called?
Eastern and Western.
Really simply named by their geography, the Eastern Front and the Western Front. The Western Front is what we have focused on so far. I will describe a little bit of the Eastern Front today. We talked about some of the new war technologies. Can you find some of the war technologies in this picture here? Flamethrower, tank, very good. Machine guns change the face of the battlefield forever.
A blimp.
The blimp, or more appropriately, the Zeppelin is correct. And what's the other flyer? What's another flying item? Airplane, yeah, airplane. First human-powered flight in 1903. 11 years later, we have airplanes all over the battlefield. So a lot of new war technology. Let me tell you super briefly about some battles on the Western Front. Western Front, mostly characterized by the trench warfare that we've been describing, the trench that you find yourself in today. The belligerents on the Western Front are generally Germany and France and Britain. Germany versus France and Britain. The United States does get involved at a certain point, and I'll tell you about that here in just a second. One of the big battles on the Western Front is the First Battle of the Marne. Now, by nature of it being called the first, you can probably think that there is a second, and that is true. The Marne was a river that was being fought over. Waterways are always very important in warfare because you can control large regions of geography based on who controls a particular waterway. So the long short of it is that this is one of the first big battles, September of 1914. That's pretty shortly after the assassination and the declarations of war. It is a costly Allied victory. Many people died. However, it is an Allied victory. So very early on, it seems like the Allies have the upper hand. Another big battle, kind of mid-war, is called the Battle of Verdun. Verdun was not a one-day battle. It's a very long and drawn-out siege, and it is very costly, very deadly for many people. So what you should write down is the Marne and Verdun. And I'm also going to tell you about the second battle of the Marne. Here is a statement from a lieutenant who was at Verdun. We've already, I think I've painted the picture for you pretty well how grisly the war is, but take it from this young lieutenant himself. He says, humanity is mad. It must be mad to do what it is doing. What a massacre. What scenes of horror and carnage. I cannot find words to translate my impressions. Hell itself cannot be so terrible. Men are mad. So take it from someone who was there, war is hell. In fact, he says hell can't be this bad. Man is mad. Why are we doing this to each other? Another battle on the Western Front, the Battle of the Somme, Somme, where there are over 1 million casualties over the course of those 4.5 months, July to November of 1916. If this was a military history class, we dive into the tactics of each of these battles. We talk about who had the upper hand and why. This is not a military history class. I'm just introducing these words to you, these big battles. And I'll just shoot you straight and say that memorizing the battle names is not really test material. I just want you to know the history, okay? The Somme, here's another statement that comes out of the Somme. Somme, the whole history of the world cannot contain a more ghastly word. So what was once just geography, right? It's the name of a town, the name of a region. It has become synonymous with the most ghastly of descriptions in all of human history. The whole history of the world cannot contain a more ghastly word. A couple of battles on the Western Front earlier on. Well, what's happening on the Eastern Front? The Eastern Front is not characterized by the same type of trench warfare. Trenches are dug, but instead of the stalemate where people just kind of stay in the same trench lines and there's not a whole lot of movement despite all the attacks and all the bombs, on the Western Front, the trenches kind of got dug and stayed where they were. Eastern Front is more characterized by large swaths of land being overtaken. We got lucky years. Vicky wasn't going to bring it. The Eastern Front, there's a lot more movement. It's not just digging in and staying there. Who are the belligerents on the Eastern Front? Germany. Okay, so Germany is sandwiched between two different fights, and that is very stressful to a country, right? There's only so many soldiers to be had. Germany's fighting on both fronts. And the other side? Russia. Yeah, that's where Russia is located. So Germany finds itself pitted against Russia. Very similarly to what we're going to see in World War II, there's fighting in Europe, but there's also fighting in the Pacific against Japan. So two very different war experiences. Western Front soldiers, Eastern Front soldiers. Maybe they're fighting in the same war, World War I, but they have very different experiences. And then, of course, we're going to see the same in World War II. And arguably, veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, even though it's the same era, have very different experiences because it's two different areas. A couple of battles on the Eastern Front for you. You can see the trench warfare there, but again, like I said, it's characterized slightly differently. Battle of Tannenberg is a major defeat for Russia. The Russians suffer very high casualties. This does not brief well on the Russian home front. As news of these high casualties at Tannenberg are printed in the newspapers, stories being carried on home, casualty letters are coming home every day, and your neighbors, their sons have died, their dads have died. As the story gets told in the Russian home front, the Russians are not really interested in this war anymore. And there begins to become inner turmoil. This sets the stage for a revolution inside of Russia in 1917. Russia is fighting on the Eastern Front, but they also have internal unrest. So now they're basically fighting with themselves. There's a lot going on in Russia at this time as well. Hang on to that. I want to tell you one more Western Front story, and this is the second Battle of the Marne. This is when the Americans do get involved. I don't even think this is on your notes. The reason I point this out is because this is the legacy of the 3rd Infantry Division, which is your hometown, homegrown Fort Stewart Army Division. You go to Fort Stewart in Hinesville, this is the Army units that is there, and this is the Army unit that I was in at Fort Stewart and when I deployed to Afghanistan. 3rd Infantry Division is nicknamed the Rock of the Marne because of how they performed at the Second Battle of the Marne. They were seen as the rock, which led, they were not going to give an inch. They were not going to lose their ground, and that is why the Allies won at the Second Battle of the Marne. So, little side extra to you so I can point out the history of the 3rd Infantry Division, and you can be proud of the 3rd ID, which is right here in Georgia. If you ever go on to Fort Stewart, for whatever reason, if you ever go through the gate, and there's a variety of reasons to go. They do a great 4th of July show. Maybe you just there's a museum on Fort Stewart. If you go through the gate, they will say to you, Rock of the Marne, and you should respond to them, Top of the Rock. That is the motto of the division. Every time we go through the gate, my wife's like, Rock of the Marne! She's really proud to have heritage. Our family has heritage in the 3rd ID. So, little side extra there so you can appreciate the division that's right here in Georgia. What's going on the Eastern Front? Remember, there's turmoil in Russia. This is called the Bolshevik Revolution. Do you recognize the man on the screen? Anybody?
Hitler.
Not quite. Not quite. Russia. He's a Russian leader. He's a famous name. He's an international bad guy. His name is Lenin. Vladimir Lenin. He is a forerunner to communism in Russia. Okay, so we're getting a little extra. We're going to peel all this back in U.S. history, how communism starts to impact United States history at large. But suffice it to say, Russia's revolution, here's what you need to actually write. Vladimir Lenin leads the communists, Bolsheviks, so that's why it can be called the Bolshevik Revolution or the Russian Revolution. They overthrow the sitting king, okay, which is called a czar, C-Z-A-R. That is very similar to a king. It's a monarchy, a little bit different form of government, which this is not a government class, but Lenin's troops overthrow the czar. Eventually, they sign a treaty with Germany in 1918, but suffice it to say, this is Russia leaving the war. With Russia leaving the war in the east, they basically agree that, hey, the border we're at right now, like, let's just call it good. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. That's more or less what the treaty says. That means Germany doesn't have to fight in the east anymore. Where can they send all their forces? To the west, to the western front. Yeah, so Germany readily agrees to this treaty. They want to get out of a two-front war and, as best they can, try to save their efforts on the western front. So this is the moment of Russia out. Russia, mic drop, Russia is out. I'm going to show you this at this point to kind of round out total war casualties. That's a lot of numbers here. How about you just look at the bottom? Look at the bottom box there. Total forces involved, 65 million. Total casualties, take your eyes to the right-hand side of that red box, 37 million. You round up, you want to give it a nice round number, literally 40 million people became casualties. Now, casualty isn't dead, it is also injured, but 40 million people had their lives affected by this war. I think it's time we end this thing. What do you say? Well, with America entering the war, the stalemate is broken. And suffice it to say, America is seen as, hey, I love patting America on the back, but I also don't want to give credit where credit's not due. This time, we deserve the credit. America showed up, and within 18 months, the war was over. So we tried to stay out of it for so long. Maybe we can wonder if we had committed forces earlier, would the war have ended earlier? Would we have saved some lives? I don't know. We can't get into that. We're not going to refight the war. But when America got involved, the strength of the American army, the training, the equipment, the success that comes with the Americans being in war essentially leads to the ultimate Allied victory. So now, since we're a player in the war, since we led to that breaking of the logjam, President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, he's the president of America at this time, he comes up with a 14-point plan to bring about peace for all of time and history. Remember, what was the nickname for the war? The war to end all wars. I know that we know it didn't. We know there's a World War II. We know there's smaller wars, whether they're declared or not, along the rest of the way. Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, like in our own history, not to mention the rest of the world around us. It is definitely not the war to end all wars. But at the time, they really thought it was. So Woodrow Wilson comes up with 14 points that he is convinced will bring about a lasting peace. I like to think of it like a sermon. His dad was actually a Presbyterian minister, so maybe his dad had 14-point sermons sometimes. Woodrow Wilson comes up with a 14-point plan, just like your preacher might preach a 14-point sermon to bring about lasting peace to the world. This is Woodrow Wilson. He's regarded as a pretty good president. He runs on so he's elected first in 1912. He runs for re-election in 1916 under what motto? Do you remember? What was his campaign slogan?
We will not be involved.
Wilson, he kept us out of the war. It's not really saying anything else he did, but it's saying what he didn't do, which was get us involved in war, right? So people, he's saying vote for me based on the fact that I kept us out of war. He did get re-elected, and he promptly entered us into the war. Now, granted, the Zimmerman telegram happened, so there were reasons, but he kept us out of the war. And then he also threw us into the war based on the Zimmerman telegram, but generally regarded as a good president. This is a picture of him. Here are Wilson's 14 points. So the big idea was for a long and lasting peace. That's what should be on your notes. But there's always a big but. Wilson's desire for peace conflicted with the other European countries and their desire to punish Germany. You got to think, we in America were not directly affected by German atrocities, German aggression, German war crimes. We can say, hey, how about let's all be friends and find lasting peace in the world? France, England, they're like phooey on that. We're going to use this treaty opportunity to punish Germany. So what you got is a conflicting ideas here. One guy wants peace. A couple other guys want to punish Germany, and that is going to bring out definitely conflict in the negotiations. This is called the Big Four. That's Wilson on the far right-hand side, and then France and Britain, and I think Belgium is the other leader there. I could be wrong, but a couple of European leaders there, and the thought bubble is saying we want to punish Germany for this war versus just arrive at a lasting peace. Here are Wilson's 14 points. This is his sermon, his 14-point sermon. So I'll just give you a second to read that.
I can't read that. I can barely even see.
You done? I know you're gonna read this. Let me highlight some things for you. So yeah, ha ha ha. That was my joke. Let me highlight some of Wilson's 14 points for you. So number 2, this is important. Free and open use of the seas for the purpose of economic trading. Because the Germans had been submarine torpedoing anyone in the seas, it becomes really important to try to clarify the seas are free for anyone to use without fear of their boat getting shot and sunk. So point number 2, super important, is open use of the seas. I got a picture of the ocean at the bottom, so I don't remember that. Number 5 is really important. So number 3, 5, and 10, it gets to the idea of open economy. Like everyone should have the right to trade with each other. It doesn't really matter. There shouldn't be restrictions on trade. And then number 10 kind of categorizes for several countries, even though it says Austria-Hungary, for several countries, Wilson's proposal was that they have the right to determine who they are. That's called self-determination. And what that means is they don't have to fall under an empire if they don't want to. You don't have to be a part of the British Empire. You don't have to be a part of the German Empire. You don't have to be a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. If you want to be your own country, you have the right to self-determination. As a previous colony, right, the Americas were colonies to the English. That's a pretty important idea to us. We had to fight for our own right to self-determine. Wilson's 14 points, number 10 there, says that everybody should have the right to determine their own destiny, whether they want to be a part of an empire as a colony or whether they want to be their own country. And then number 14, so I'm going to circle the word self-determination there. Number 14 speaks about the creation of a League of Nations. Do you know what the League of Nations is before I go any farther? So does the League of Nations exist today?
Yes.
No. What exists today?
United Nations.
You guys know the United Nations. So let me tell you the sad story of the League of Nations. Here's a primary source newspaper. It says Wilson, Germany asks for peace based on Wilson's 14-point plan. Germany's willing to surrender based on Wilson's 14 points. The problem will become that the peace treaty doesn't really look like Wilson's 14 points. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. This leads to an armistice, not a full-on peace treaty, but an armistice. An armistice is the laying down of the arms. And we really just talked about this. We just crossed the holiday that we know as Veterans Day, but initially it was Armistice Day. The guns went silent at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. That's November 11th at 11 a.m., 1918. That's why we observe Veterans Day on November 11th. Pretty cool movie clip that shows the guns going silent. If we end up with time, I'll show this. But suffice it to say, the guns went silent so that they could negotiate the peace treaty. We stopped fighting to give the diplomats a chance to do their side of the work. Okay, so soldiers stopped shooting, diplomats started negotiating. The result of negotiations is called the Treaty of Versailles. Versailles is the town in which it was signed. That's why these treaties are always named after the town that they're in. This is signed on June 28th, 1914, which, perfect irony, is exactly 5 years to the day after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was assassinated on June 28, 1914. The treaty is signed June 28, 1918. So I don't know if they tried to land on that day on purpose, but it definitely worked out. Pretty kind of a poetic ending since it ended on the exact same day.
I got two things.
Sure, send it.
One, that says 1914 right there.
Oh man, it should say 1918.
And for 2, that's only 4 years, not 5 years.
No, it's the 5th anniversary. So 14 to 15 to 16, 17 to 18, 14 to 15, 16, 17, 18. Christian, you're right. You're right on both accounts. 1, it should say 1918, my bad. 2, it should say 4 years to the day of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Thanks for calling me out on the small stuff. Appreciate it. So at the negotiating table was the big 3, U.S., UK, and France. Who is not at the negotiating table?
Russia.
Germany.
Russia, they quit the war. Germany. Now, granted, they're the losers and they're the bad guys, but they were not at the table for the negotiations that would affect the rest of their country's history. So it's seen as the winners dominated Germany, who lost. Again, what was the European attitude? What did they want to do to Germany? Punish them. And that's exactly what happened. The treaty does not at all resemble the gracious attitude of Wilson's 14 points. Wilson's 14 points was to bring about peace. The Treaty of Versailles actually arguably brings about World War II. It's a very weak treaty, hard to enforce. It only made the Germans angrier, gave rise to a dude that was formerly known as Corporal Hitler, gives rise to Adolf Hitler, and arguably leads to World War II. So here's what was in the Treaty of Versailles. Germany had to, I'll give you a chance to write all this down. Germany had to accept full responsibility for the war. Germany lost all the territory that it acquired forcefully throughout the war. Germany had to pay reparations, that's financial, that's money, had to pay money to the Allies to make up for how much money the war cost. And Germany now could only have a very limited military in size. They were capped on how large their army and their navy could be. I'll let you write this down because I know this is written on your notes exactly like this. I'm going to give you a cute little acronym to remember these 4 things a little bit more easily in just a second. So I see pencils writing. When you're done, I will move on. Christian's like, I got 2 points today. Swanson showed 2,000 slides this semester, but I got him on that one. All right, are we done with the notes verbatim? Raise your hand if you have ever been called a brat. Couple of you willing to admit it? Raise your hand if you've ever eaten a bratwurst. Hot dog, bratwurst? Okay, so the acronym I'm going to give you is BRAT. Whether that means a brat or a brat to you, hopefully you'll remember it. Here is how you can remember the Treaty of Versailles based off of brat. 1, Germany accepts blame. B is for blame. 2, Germany is forced to pay reparations. That's financial. Blame, reparations. 3, Germany is limited. The size of Germany's army is limited to less than 100,000 troops. That's a pretty small army. And the reason for that was they thought that the thinking was if you have a small army, you can't invade your neighbors. So we will recognize that you have a right to self-defense. You can have an army for self-defense, but your army is limited in size so that you can't invade your neighbors. So that's blame, reparations, army, and then T, Germany loses the territory that it had acquired throughout the war. So BRAT, blame, reparations, army, limited in size, territories given back. BRA and T. If you've ever been called a brat, maybe that'll be easy for you to remember.
It says they limited their army to 100,000. How long did they think that was going to last?
Ray asked a really good question. Here, I don't expect you to read every word here. Here are the actual specifications of the Treaty of Versailles. So, Ray, I'll point out here, it is specifically written 100,000 for the Army, 15,000 for the Navy. Ray said, did they really expect Germany to follow that? Is that more or less your question?
Or not? Did they want them to keep it that way forever?
Oh, for how long? Yeah, so that's a good question. I don't know if there was an expiration date on the treaty. I'm going to look that up, Ray. I'll just give you the plot twist. Hitler, at a certain point, is going to flat out ignore that. And guess what? Ain't no one going to do nothing about it. Hitler just blatantly expands the size of Germany's army. We'll get to this the week after Thanksgiving. And the Europeans who negotiated this treaty in the first place, they're going to be like, okay. So they've written this down, but the actual enforcement of it doesn't really go over all that well. If you have a good question, did they expect them to stay at that number for how long? I don't know. I'm going to try to find that out. Right? Good question. How do you think this treaty was received in Germany? Horrible. Why?
Their land.
Pretty raw deal if you're a German national, right? Now, granted, you've been fighting against these countries and you did lose the war, but if you're German by birth, you didn't really have a part in the war, maybe you think you're right anyway, right? Because God's on your side, not theirs. This is a pretty raw deal, pretty imbalanced treaty. It is in favor of the Brits and the French, and it is pretty harsh towards the Germans. The German word for this, the Germans started calling the Treaty Decat, which means a dictated peace, not a real peace. Okay, have you ever made that? Hey, bro, are we good? Are we okay? All right, it's behind us, but you didn't really mean it, right? It's that a truce, but not really a truce. The Germans called it a dictated peace, and the problem here is you can't tell someone to be at peace with you just by your words. You want to arrive at actual peace. They basically did not arrive at actual peace. It was a dictated peace. The Germans started to call it a stab in the back. They called the treaty the stab in the back. And German citizens referred to their leaders who negotiated the treaty, or rather who signed the treaty because they didn't have a chance to negotiate. They called them the November criminals. Since it went into effect in November, they basically said anyone who signed this treaty on behalf of all Germans is a criminal. So was not received very well in Germany. That last point of Wilson's 14 points, what was it? To establish a what?
League of Nations.
League of Nations. So the League of Nations does get established. The League of Nations has a birth date and a death date. Okay, it went into effect in 1919, but it died in 1946. It is generally regarded as a very ineffective international organization. Now, and the idea of it was great. The idea was to bring all nations together, a forum for conversation. If we have issues with each other, we can talk about it openly. We can vote on resolutions. If any member nation is aggressive to another member nation, we can deal with it inside of our organization. The idea of the League of Nations was great. Sounds like a great idea. But the problem is not every country could agree on all the inside rules. And in fact, the country that proposed it never joined it. What country is that? America. Woodrow Wilson proposes a League of Nations. The United States Congress never votes to join it, right? There's a lot of debate, a lot of argument. And let me summarize that the United States Congress never votes to even join the League of Nations. Political cartoon, really descriptive, might be something you would see on something like the EOC. It shows that Uncle Sam's hands are essentially handcuffed by the League of Nations. He's being pulled in a bunch of different directions. England, Japan, European nations, other foreign nations. Uncle Sam is handcuffed by the idea of the League of Nations. And in fact, the United States, who proposed the idea, never even joins the organization. Now, cut to the chase. Today, we have the United Nations, which does serve a pretty close to the same purpose. I'm not going to get into geopolitics right now, but the United Nations does serve kind of the same idea as the League of Nations, and the United States is a member of the United Nations. We're going to round it out here, guys. We've had some big ideas. This is definitely an honors class conversation, so thank you for staying involved. Here are the lasting effects. 3 big categories: political, social, and economic. Political, social, and economic. So first big idea is that the United States emerges as a world power. Yay for us. We won a world war. We are responsible for the victory in the war. That makes us a world power. Germany is crushed by the defeat. It is said that the German spirit is deflated. They are offended. They are angry. They feel like they've been stomped on. And in a short 20 years, they're going to try to make sure that they get their spot back on the world stage that leads to World War II. There's a high civilian casualty rate, 8 million civilians dead, 10 million soldiers dead, 40 million total casualties, that is injured and dead. So this really affected the lives of a lot of people, changed generations, right? Wiped off the face of the map, totally changes the course of human history with how many people were dead and injured. And then economically, $300 billion was the cost of the war in those dollars. Adjust for inflation, that's $4.3 trillion. That is a huge debt to the worldwide debt. You know, a huge cost, worldwide cost, based on all the war. It's very financially costly. The next picture I'm going to show you is how the map changed. Like literally, the map of Europe changed because of the war. So you can see in 1914 the size of Germany, Austria-Hungary. Now look to the right-hand side. There's not even an Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary disappeared from the face of the map because of World War I. It does not exist anymore. Now there's an Austria and there's a Hungary, but the Empire of Austria-Hungary, as you see right here, literally does not exist anymore, and it becomes Czechoslovakia, Austria-Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, Poland, etc. So Archduke Franz Ferdinand, he gets shot, and all of a sudden his country 4 years later does not even exist anymore. Germany is reduced in size greatly. Russia gets broken into, a variety of other smaller states as well. So suffice it to say, the reason there are so many flags in the world today is because of national breakups that start to happen at this time. World War I, and of course, we're going to continue to see some more in World War II. We're going to round out your last block, which I think says the mandate system. The mandate system, this is a big world history idea. Not going to elaborate too much, but this starts to shape the Middle East. What was once the Ottoman Empire now gets broken into things like Turkey and Armenia and Iran and Syria, etc. So Great Britain and France, since they're the winners, partial winners of the war, they divide up the Middle East. British takes Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine as colonies. France takes Syria and Lebanon as colonies. That is not the case any longer today. Those countries are not colonies, but this is the beginning of the shape of the Middle East. And it all starts with World War I right here. So, y'all, that was a big conversation. I think we had the sentimental conversation, we had the facts, and I think we've closed it out pretty well. Tomorrow, we are going to live World War I. Are you done with your notes?
Yes.
Okay, slide them to your right, slide them to Kylie and Madison. If you're not done, I will take them tomorrow.
Okay.
If you're not done, I'll take them tomorrow. So, yeah, let me talk about tomorrow. Here's what we're going to do. I'm not going to keep it a secret from you. We are going to live World War I through water balloons and squirt guns.
We gotta get wet.
We are first we're gonna rehab, I'm gonna show you the trench warfare tactics. We're gonna remind ourselves, I'm gonna talk about it in the room. But then we're gonna go out to where the band practices, right? There's lines already drawn where the band practices. I'm gonna set you up in different trenches. No, it won't be dug into the ground, but we are gonna have lines, okay, trench lines. And we're gonna use the tactics. We're gonna start with an artillery bombardment. What would that be? Water balloons. And then each side is gonna take turns going over the top. So everybody's gonna participate on both sides, but that one side is gonna assault and probably get cut down by the water guns. And then we'll flip sides, right? So it's not going to be full-on chaos. It is going to simulate the tactics. Do you need to bring extra clothes? Up to you. Like, seriously, I'll kind of leave that up to you. I will offer you the same uniforms, okay? As an outer garment. I'm not going to change clothes, but as an outer garment, you can put this on. If you feel you need to bring a jacket, that might be a good idea. I don't think, I've been wrong before, I don't think anyone's going to get clobbered in a way that they're just straight up soaked. But I've been wrong before.
What if they just walk?
Simple answer is I'll leave it up to you. I'll leave it up to you.
What do we do with Treaty?
Now, here my voice clap once. I called it, that'd be good. I like to live under the idea, my classroom operates under the idea of challenge by choice. Now, I like to help people out of their comfort zone and have fun experiences, but I will never say, sit down, shut up, and let someone shoot a water gun at you, okay? It's called a challenge by choice. If you choose to not be challenged, that's fine, but I do think we're gonna have a lot of fun with it. So I know that's vague, that's ambiguous. Should you bring a change of clothes or not? Yes, it's up to you. That is what those are the decisions you have to make as an adult, okay, as a growing adult. Should I bring a change of clothes or not? Swanson has told me exactly what we're gonna do. Now I have to decide what I need to bring to school. Does that make sense? It will be fun. Kylie said, "Can we bring water guns?" Here is my limitation on that. It has to be the simple squirter, not the super soaker. Because squirt is something that'll dry on your clothing. Super soaking is not what I'm going for. So I will. If it is, here's the other. Very similar to Nerf guns. It has to be concealable in your backpack. You bring it straight here. You bring it straight here. You do not flash it around the school. It has to be in the sides of your backpack. Does that make sense? And that goes for any other water toy that you're trying to think about right now. What's your other question?
I'll bring you water balloons.
No.
No.
Okay, so on water balloons, if you want to bring me water balloons, I think that's great. But I don't have a way. I'm going to be filling up water balloons tonight. I don't have a way to fill up water balloons in the morning. So if you got to put them in a bed of water. If you want to bring me something like water balloons, you can talk to me. I might ask you to like bring them to the back of the school or something like that. I don't know, because I'm already going to be situated in the morning. I'm already going to have the field set up. So if you want to contribute supplies, you could bring the supplies to the field and we can go from there. Does that make sense? I hope so.
Me too.
Okay, so I've laid it all out for you. You know what to expect. It will be fun. It will not be a mystery to you. And then we'll like celebrate that we're going to take 9 days off and have Thanksgiving. Okay. Go ahead. Where's my notes?
Think about it.
If you did not have your notes ready to turn in, they are not late. You can bring them to me tomorrow. Yes, you have advisory, which we'll go to after this.
We do that in second block, don't we?
Huh?